Hello and welcome to Hamilton the Podcast. I'm Vinton Bain.
And I'm Robbie Herlocker. We made it!
We did. We made it. We're here. We're at the end of the musical.
Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story is the final song in our musical, but our podcast will not end after this episode. The curtain call is going to close, but we have some fun, exciting plans we've already told you about on our podcast that I hope you stick around for.
That's right. We're going to be doing lots of different Hamilton-related things, including going over other musicals related, 1776, In the Heights. We're going to be talking about the cast and the crew as soon as we're done here next week. And then we're going to be diving into some more history and doing some short 10-minute histories and some longer in-depth looks at history.
Jumping right into the staging of this song, remember we saw Aaron Burr at the front of the stage. He had just been reminiscing on his life after he killed his friend Alexander Hamilton in a duel, and he was reciting that quote for us, saying, "The world is wide enough for both Hamilton and me." So we saw that reflectiveness in his face, in his performance, and in his voice, and it came across on the original cast recording. Now, the lights are going to fade out, and we're going to see another old familiar face walk to the front of the stage and take over the storytelling from that narrator.
That's right. Washington comes out on stage and he's wearing all white. And in our musical, this is a sign of someone that has already passed on.
In a couple of stanzas, we will hear President Jefferson and President Madison speak about the reputation of Alexander Hamilton. And after they speak, a cast member will come forward and will give them both white coats. And they get to join the ensemble there. And I think it has that obvious connotation of passing over to the other side because Washington is watching from the other side.
Right.
But it also has the connotation of just becoming a part of the background in this musical. Because remember, we've portrayed the entire ensemble members throughout this entire musical as dressed in white. And so when you see someone like George Washington starting off in bright colors, and he's the venerated Virginian veteran whose men are all lining up to put him up on a pedestal, and they're absolutely worshiping him while he's alive, he's going to come on stage, and he's just a part of the story now. He's a part of the background, and he sees himself as this person that history had its eyes on, but he's no longer in control of the story that we're telling about him. He's no longer a part of acting in that story. He's now a part of the ensemble who just gets to be a piece of the American history that we see. And so I think it's telling there to see that we are all people who have these moments in our lives when we get to make an impact. We have these moments when we get to do things. We get to plant these seeds in a garden, but we may never get to see the thing that comes from it. And so we eventually will just fade into the background of our histories, and it's up to someone else to continue telling that story.
That's right. And that's what we're going to see throughout this whole song here. It's worth noting that the original version of the finale here started out with Eliza reading a version of Hamilton's final goodbye letter to her. And I like that they changed that and that they brought Washington out here to start this thing off because it really is about legacy and about history. And we already had Eliza dealing with the death of Hamilton in the last song, and we talked about the letter there. And Eliza's going to be introduced here again, but it's going to be much more powerful having to wait for the first half of this finale for her to come on stage and take her part.
When Ron Chernow wrote his biography about Alexander Hamilton, he said that he really was trying hard to not end his story with the duel and the death. He thought that that was a pretty morbid way to end. He thought it was a little depressing. And so he added the epilogue to his book, and he put the epilogue in there that's all about Eliza. And he bookends his biography with chapters about Eliza. The prologue and the epilogue are about her in her elder years. So when Ron Chernow was watching Lin-Manuel's performance of this in the public theater for the first time when he watched this, he was curious about what was going on, what was going to happen, and how he was going to end the story. And he saw Eliza walk forward, and he says, "Oh my goodness, they're doing the epilogue. They're doing my epilogue in the end of this musical," because he said that the way I wanted to end my biography was not with the death of the hero of my story, but with the continuing of his legacy. How was he respected? How was he treated after he passed away? What went on? Because when someone we love dies, we still have to carry on. We have to carry that torch and continue finding ways to cope with it and move through that grief into something new and how to build something better out of the tragedy that we had. So this story is clearly a tragedy. We saw Alexander Hamilton's ambitious climb into prominence, and then in the second act, we saw his fall from glory. His ambition became his folly. He was the Icarus who flew too high, too close to the sun, and his wings melted, and he just collapsed and lost so many things. But unlike many Greek tragedies or Shakespearean tragedies, when Alexander Hamilton passed away, everyone else in his life had to carry on and see what to do with that. And so this musical is reminding us here at the end that those lasting contributions he made, those seeds that he planted in the garden, did get to grow into something, and they grew into the American narrative that we know today because of people like Eliza watering that seed he planted, people like Eliza telling his story and carrying on that legacy and that narrative and bringing it to us even today, and people like Lin-Manuel Miranda writing this musical, taking us full circle back to the very mission that Eliza set forward of making sure that justice was done to the legacy of her Hamilton.
That's right. And carrying on the legacy beyond someone's death was a theme that we saw when Washington first gave this advice to Hamilton in History Has Its Eyes on You. And it's what he comes on stage here to repeat, to set up the theme for this song. He comes out and he says, "Let me tell you what I wished I'd known. When I was young and dreamed of glory, you have no control. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story." And it's at that point that Burr takes over again and introduces President Jefferson.
Thomas Jefferson has a wonderful line encapsulating a lot of his own character, as we've seen it throughout this second act of the musical, but also a lot of the history is inside of the Thomas Jefferson presidency. Because when Thomas Jefferson became president, even though the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians had been fighting each other for a really, really long time, there was some interesting stuff that happened during the Jeffersonian presidency that really did vindicate Alexander Hamilton's legacy. And so we're going to see in this particular stanza where Thomas Jefferson will kind of explain somewhat about what he tried to do to Hamilton's financial system. The line that David Diggs recites for us on the album is, "I'll give him this. His financial system is a work of genius. I couldn't undo it if I tried." And then he confesses, "And I did try. I tried."
Right. There's that pause there. And I think people are just thinking that's where it's going to end. But then he's like, "And I did try." Believe me. It's almost a begrudging compliment to me that it's a work of genius.
Yeah, exactly. He does not want to compliment the man who has been his primary political opponent ever since coming back from his stint as a French ambassador. He has been stopped at every political milestone by Hamilton.
Yeah, and Jefferson had this Secretary of Treasury who he wanted to reduce taxes, and he wanted him to basically go in and try to dismantle Alexander Hamilton's financial systems.
Yeah, Albert Gallatin was Thomas Jefferson's Treasury Secretary, and Jefferson said, "I want you to uncover the blunders and the frauds of Hamilton. I want you to go into the system. Now that we have Republicans in power, we can go in and undermine everything he did." He set up that national bank, the Bank of the United States, the first bank of the U.S., we want to dismantle it and destroy it. He set up the Treasury Department in a certain way, and we know that there's fraud somewhere. He was speculating somewhere. He obviously was siphoning funds somewhere along the line. So he tasks his Treasury Secretary with that.
That's right. I really love this quote by Gallatin himself, talking about Jefferson, asking him, "Well, Gallatin, what have you found?" And he answered, "I've found the most perfect system ever formed. Any change that should be made in it would injure it. Hamilton made no blunders, committed no frauds. He did nothing wrong." And then he says, "I think Mr. Jefferson was disappointed."
Right, that was definitely not what Thomas Jefferson wanted to hear whatsoever. Gallatin complimented Hamilton in a number of ways, with that quote for sure, but then also he went on and he said something about how Hamilton had done such an outstanding job. As the architect of our early government, he set up this well-oiled machine that was now just going to require a little bit of maintenance here and there as long as they stuck to Hamilton's plan. When Ron Chernow looks back on this event when Albert Gallatin was trying to wrestle with the Treasury Department under Jefferson, Chernow looks back and he says that Jefferson's more extreme impulses were restrained by the Treasury Secretary, this guy who was supposed to be helping Jefferson lower all of the taxes and get rid of all of the federal taxes, was now praising Hamilton's system. And to be fair, they did lower a lot of the taxes. They did get rid of a lot of the things that were in the previous Federalist administrations, but Gallatin ended up being a counterbalance to some of the things Jefferson originally wanted to just throw away, because Gallatin got to educate him on things like the importance of the Customs Service and the national debt.
So then the company comes back in with Washington, repeating this who lives, who dies, who tells your story, as they're going to do throughout the song. And Burr then introduces President Madison.
He took our country from bankruptcy to prosperity. I hate to admit it, but he doesn't get enough credit for all the credit he gave us.
I love that wordplay.
So in history, even though Albert Gallatin had been trying to convince the Republicans that Hamilton's departments in the Treasury and the bank had been wisely and skillfully managed, the Republicans still did not see the need for a central bank. They didn't think that they needed a centralized bank. So when James Madison took over after Thomas Jefferson's 2 terms as president, James Madison allowed the bank's charter to expire. Remember that Hamilton set it up under the first Washington administration, and then eventually it needed to be renewed. And Madison just let it go, thinking there's no reason we need this. It's still a layer of Hamiltonian federalism that isn't important to us. But then the whole War of 1812 happened under Madison's watch, and he realized that there might be something to that whole having a central bank where we can regulate currency and interest rates and talk about how to financially get out of a terrible situation. And so Madison sponsored, after letting the first bank expire, he sponsored the second bank of the United States. And then his critics said that he out-Hamiltoned Alexander Hamilton. But it's interesting, don't you think, that the first 2 Republican presidents looked back on Hamilton's legacy and said, oh, those things we hated and attacked consistently, we needed those.
Right. I like that it's almost from beyond the grave. The systems that Hamilton put in place are him going, I told you.
Right.
You need this. And again, after Madison speaks, who lives, who dies, who tells your story, and Angelica now comes out and says, every other founding father story gets told. Every other founding father gets to grow old. And we already touched on this in the last episode. 49 wasn't that young to die at the time, yet the founding fathers themselves lived quite a bit longer than that.
Yeah, the first several presidents did live a much longer time than the average person at that point. I think it's interesting that in the staging here, this is the moment when Jefferson and Madison are putting on their white coats. And it's almost as if the ensemble is getting to galvanize their founding fathers. They're getting to hand over this coat to the people that they revere. They're helping to welcome Thomas Jefferson and welcome James Madison into the pantheon of American history. And what we'll see by the end of this song is that only 2 characters are not galvanized in white. And that's going to be our man, Alexander Hamilton, because we're fighting to tell his story right now. And the ensemble had not been galvanizing his story up at this point. And then the other person is the villain in our histories, Aaron Burr, who also does not get to be galvanized into the American pantheon. He is, in the words of Nancy Eisenberg, the fallen founder, who is not revered and not respected in the way that some of those other founding political figures were.
And we've touched a lot on in this podcast how Hamilton's history hasn't been as remembered as other founding fathers, like this line says. I like to think that 10 to 20 years from now, people will look back and view this musical and this line and this idea in this musical and go, what are they talking about? Hamilton's one of the most revered, famous founding fathers ever. It'll be because of this musical.
Yeah, I definitely want to see that happen. It's interesting how history is always written by the people who still live, and we get to remember the people in whatever way we choose to remember them. We have the best research we can. We try to dive into the documents and be as accurate as we possibly could be, but the narratives we tell are usually stronger than the documents that are just in the libraries gathering dust. The stories that we tell, the narratives that we tell are way bigger. And we've been telling this narrative of Jeffersonian democracy and Hamiltonian aristocracy for a really long time in American history, so much so that we have reduced these 2 political figures, just to look at Jefferson and Hamilton alone for a second, we've reduced them so much that we often don't remember the depth and the width of their characters and the depth and the width of their flaws and how intensely flawed and human their story really was. And so this particular musical is a regaining of that legacy, trying to say, hey, remember how human these people were. Remember how flawed they were. but also celebrate their victories and celebrate the things that deserve celebrating.
And then Burr says, but when you're gone, who remembers your name? Who keeps your flame? To me, this might be a stretch, but this is a little bit of a callback to Burr at the beginning of this musical when he says, what's your name, man? And the cast announces Alexander Hamilton, saying this is the point of this whole musical. We're remembering his name.
I like that idea of framing the entire story within the context of Burr saying, hey, who is this kid? What is his name? And then returning at the end of it saying, who will remember this name? That's a nice little device there. It's also, to me, telling that you see Aaron Burr asking these questions here. When you're gone, who remembers your name? Who keeps your flame and who tells your story? At the end of Aaron Burr's story, his daughter, Theodosia, has already passed away in a tragic shipwreck. He doesn't have someone that he can logically just pass the torch to, so to speak. He doesn't have the legacy children that Hamilton might have had, the people that he could pass the story along, one person to the next. And so in Hamilton's case, he had several kids who grew up to, some of them following political paths, some of them not, but most of them did continue his legacy, fought for his legacy. They were Hamiltons with pride.
Right. He even had a son who was one of his first biographers.
Yeah, James Alexander Hamilton grew up to be the acting Secretary of State under Andrew Jackson as president, but he also did undertake the efforts of being one of Hamilton's first biographers. He took a lot of the work that Eliza had compiled together of getting all these letters together. We'll talk about that in a second. But he took a lot of that work and put it into the biography, a memoir about his father. And it's interesting that you get to see this idea of legacy. And I think a lot of people will talk about legacy as something you pass on to your children. You pass on to the people who are supposed to outlive you. And in Aaron Burr's situation, we have that reminder that he doesn't have those natural heirs of his legacy. He inherited a legacy that was interesting at the beginning of this musical. He was the grandson of the fire and brimstone preacher, Jonathan Edwards, in the Americas. And yet at the end of this, who is Aaron Burr going to pass his legacy on to? He inherited something big. He had something to lose, as he sang in the song Wait For It. And Alexander Hamilton didn't have anything to lose. But in this moment, Burr is the one without someone to pass the torch to.
And there is that idea of torch passing to your family in that line, who keeps your flame. But it also calls back to My Shot to Me. When Alexander Hamilton says, the plan is to turn this spark into a flame, and we as a country now carry that flame as a governmental system, and all the things that he's put forth that still go on today, we carry that flame as well.
Right, he's reminding us that the Americas here that we have are the spark that Hamilton fanned into a flame, and he's just putting it out there in a question form, saying, who's going to take that flame to the next generation? And throughout American history, we have seen some heroes step up to take that flame to a new area. And through movements like the Civil Rights Movement, we've seen different movements with women's rights in different areas there where we see things that Hamilton started out with. And we see these moments of Americans stepping forward saying, I'm going to take that flame a little bit further, a little bit farther, a little bit more intensity on the heat of this fire that is American passion. And we see that flame that we have inherited, that torch that we have received from our founding fathers that's been passed down to us, is something that we can run with and we can embrace as long as we continue to advance the American narrative.
And Burr and the men and Angelica and the women are going to go back and forth with the lyrics, who tells your story? Who tells your story? And then the women will answer this question, Eliza. And Eliza comes out and she completes that arc where she earlier in the musical said, let me be a part of the narrative. And then she said, I'm erasing myself from the narrative. And now she's saying, I put myself back in the narrative.
It's so meaningful right there. When Eliza comes to the front of the stage, she sings that line, I put myself back in the narrative, and then her first stanza says, I stop wasting time on tears, I live another 50 years, it's not enough. So one thing that I think Eliza Hamilton herself, being the strong, confident, quietly brave woman that she was, I think that she would not tell people that tears are a sign of weakness or a sign of something completely useless, but Eliza Hamilton was a worker and was a hard worker at that. And so when she comes into this, she doesn't have a lot of time, historically or in this musical, to grieve, just sitting in the moment of tears. She had a really rough period of time here where she lost in history. She had within 3 years lost 4 close people to her. She lost her eldest son, Philip. She lost her sister, Peggy, and Peggy from our musical. She lost her mother, and she lost her husband, all within a 3-year span. Not to mention the mental breakdown of her eldest daughter, Angelica, who was named after her sister. So she had lots and lots of things happening in this short amount of time. So in this moment, I don't think Eliza's looking back and she's shaming people who are crying. She's not shaming people who are dealing with really intense grief. Because remember, she went through that phase. She had a whole song where she couldn't even get words out because she was so pained and hurt. But here she's looking back and she's saying, I have responsibilities. I have kids that need me. I have people I need to protect. I have people I need to pursue, financial things I need to get in order. And so now I need to get down to business, and I need to stop wasting time on efforts that aren't moving this story forward. And so in history, Eliza takes over a lot of things, and she puts a lot of things into motion that show she is truly a boss.
Yeah, I feel like this stanza particularly shows that Eliza is taking on the characteristics of Hamilton here after his death. That she is now, like Hamilton when Lawrence died, diving deep into work. And she is going to start working like she's running out of time. And that line, it's not enough. Throughout this musical, she was saying that would be enough. That would be enough.
Right.
And now she's saying it's not enough. Now she's the one who can never be satisfied. And there's not going to be enough time for her to do everything that she wants to do in telling this story and promoting this legacy. There's this quote from someone who went to see Eliza, and he said, "The bust of Hamilton I can never forget, for the old lady always paused before it in her tour of the rooms and, leaning on her cane, gazed and gazed, as if she could never be satisfied."
Right. And when I read that line in the prologue of Chernow's biography, it was chilling because remember, I went back to the biography after having heard all of the musical before. So I was singing the lines, "I will never be satisfied," over and over and over again in my head. And when I first read in the prologue of this story that Eliza in her elder years is the one that Chernow applies that sentence to, saying she will never be satisfied, it was goosebumps all up and down my arms, saying that, oh my goodness, she is like her husband in so many ways. She is going to exceed her husband in certain ways, and she's going to learn from her husband in certain ways, challenge him in a lot of ways, and be a pillar of strength for him in a lot of ways. But after he passes away, she is the one carrying that flame. She is the one, to answer Aaron Burr's question, that is taking Hamilton's legacy to the masses and is running that torch as far as she can possibly take it. And she will not be satisfied until everybody hears the story of her beloved Hamilton.
And it's worth noting that Eliza never would see the fulfillment of this biography of Hamilton in her lifetime, so it wasn't enough living that extra 50 years to see it all come together.
Yeah, so a couple of his siblings got really mad at James Alexander whenever he took a little bit too long to finish and publish the memoir, because if his mother had lived a little bit longer, then she might have been able to see the culmination of all of her hard work, where she did go out and interview every soldier who fought by his side, as the next line says. She actually wrote out little questionnaires and mailed them to people that had interacted with her husband. She wanted to interview these people, learn about their interactions with her husband, see what they thought about him, what he felt about him. She also tracked down letters that Hamilton had sent to George Washington that were at Mount Vernon in George Washington's estate in his protected chests. And she went there and dove through everything he wrote there to try to protect everything that had ever been penned by Hamilton. And in fact, she was so diligent in collecting the quote-unquote thousands of pages of writings that he did provide. And then the next line, she says, "I try to make sense of your thousands of pages of writings. You really did write like you were running out of time." And she is going through this so much that people like Ron Chernow have speculated that because she was so diligent in protecting his letters, that it just doesn't make sense that her letters wouldn't have survived. So she must have done something like burning her love letters to Hamilton. She must have burned them away because she was self-effacing. She didn't want to preserve her own portion of the story. And so that speculation is complete speculation. We've talked about that when we covered the song Burn. But it is interesting the amount of careful dedication and attention she puts to collecting and preserving Hamilton's letters, that she doesn't put into her own writings.
Right.
In fact, I remember reading, I think it was in Chernow's epilogue, where Eliza for a long time wore a bag around her neck, a little locket that had a bag where she put in 2 letters from Hamilton. One was a sonnet that he wrote to her while he was pursuing her back in Morristown when they first started courting. And by the time that she was elder in her years, the pages of that letter had to be sewn together because they were decomposing and breaking and crumbling apart, but she took so much care that she preserved those. And then she also put in that little bag the letter that he had written to her carefully the night before he was sent off to the duel. And so she had the first moment of their correspondence and the last moment of their correspondence in this bag, very, very close to her literal heart, because she cared so much for this man that she wanted to continue his legacy.
And when she does say, I interview every soldier who fought by your side, Mulligan, Lafayette, and Lawrence will sing out, she tells our story. And then, as Robbie said, she says she tries to make sense of the thousands of pages of writing, and she's not exaggerating here. Chernow tells us that between the years of 1961 and 1987, a team at Columbia University published 32 volumes spanning 22,000 pages of his letters.
Wow. I remember complaining about 20-page research papers in college.
It's funny that she has this line of, you really do write like you're running out of time. Even though she's been saying this throughout the musical, why do you write like you're running out of time? Like, she knows it, but now that she's having to pour through it all, she's blown away that she didn't even understand how much he was writing, like he was running out of time.
Right, there's a realization there.
And when they do say time, the company joins on that, and that's going to be another returning motif throughout the rest of this song.
Another resource that Eliza used throughout her lifetime was Angelica, her sister, the one she loved, the one she was very, very close to throughout this entire musical. She says, I rely on Angelica. While she's alive, we tell your story. So Angelica did help to compile a lot of these resources together. She helped to do some of the research with Eliza, but Eliza outlived her sister by several years.
That's right. Angelica Schuyler Church dies on March 13th, 1814, at the age of 58. She was only able to continue that Hamilton legacy with Eliza for 10 years. And as Eliza sings here in the musical, she's buried in Trinity Church near you, where Philip and Eliza are also buried today.
And if you happen to be walking through Lower Manhattan yourself, you may be able to see this same churchyard at Trinity Church, where you'll find the gravestone of Alexander Hamilton.
And that is also the same church where 5 of the Hamilton children were baptized and the family owned Pew 92. I don't know if they have any kind of sign notifying that to this day, but I thought that was kind of cool because back in those days, that's how you contributed to the church in one way. And we didn't mention this when we talked about Hamilton's death, but there's a gravestone there, like you said, for Hamilton, and it says, the Corporation of Trinity Church has erected this in testimony of their respect for the patriot of incorruptible integrity, the soldier of approved valor, the statesman of consummate wisdom, whose talents and virtues will be admired long after this marble shall have moldered into dust. He died July 12th, 1804, aged 47, which historians still debate to this day whether he was 47 or 49.
Right, we talked about that early on in this podcast about how there may have been some lying or some fluctuating about his age when he came to the Americas, but we're not sure.
Eliza says, when I needed her most, she was right on. And then the company comes back in, time. And continuing that same thought that she had earlier of it not being enough, she says, and I'm still not through. I ask myself, what would you do if you had more time?
So here, Eliza is explicitly declaring to the audience that she is the one who is picking up where Hamilton left off. She's not letting his story end. She's not letting the cover close on the story of her husband. She's going to pick up the pen and start writing herself, so to speak. She's going to go into the next chapter of her life, dedicating it to the memory of her beloved husband. She's going to continue doing the things he wanted to do. And so there's that question that we often ask ourselves when we're trying to honor people who have passed away. What could I do to honor their memory? What can I do to honor their legacy and to do right by them, to do right by their memory? And so we talk about the Washington Monument and building those things up, but the thing that Eliza wants to do to commemorate her husband is she wants to do the things that he would have done if he had more time. And Eliza declares there, "The Lord in his kindness, he gives me what you always wanted. He gives me more time." I like that she's often addressing her words to Hamilton here.
Right.
It's not just the blanket statements to the audience. She's very dedicated and devoted to her husband, so much so that you almost get this idea of the widow who is now speaking sometimes to her late husband, saying, "Hamilton, I wish you were here. Hamilton, I can't wait to see you again. Hamilton, I'm ready to be beside you." And that is very much what Chernow describes when he's talking about Elder Eliza in the prologue and epilogue of his stories. It's this woman who is frequently consumed with passion for being reunited with her husband.
And Eliza's going to say, "He gives me more time." And the key is going to go up half a step here as we recount Eliza's accomplishments.
Yeah, I like the fact that this key change comes, and it's almost like she is changing her composure as well. She's collected herself. She's been allowing herself the opportunity to dwell on what he would have done, what he might have done, talking to him somewhat. And here she says, okay, it's time to stop wasting time on tears. I'm moving on. This is what I'm going to do. And the first thing she says she does is I raise funds in D.C. for the Washington Monument. And I love that George Washington is the one who steps forward in his white coat at the end and sings behind her, "She tells my story." It's so tender.
And Eliza moved to Washington, D.C. in 1848, the same year that the cornerstone for this monument was laid. And she worked closely with Dolly Madison in raising funds for the monument. But the donations would run out the same year that Eliza would pass away in 1854. And it would actually take until 1888 for the monument to be completed after the Civil War and a bunch of other things that held it back.
Right, so she did a lot of the legwork trying to get this monument built and set up. And she was one of the people we have to credit for being able to have that monument today. After singing "She Tells My Story," George Washington, Chris Jackson, steps backwards into the ensemble and he kind of nods his head towards her. It's like he's very appreciative, very humbled by the fact that she would tell his story. He's the one who has known this entire musical that he wouldn't get to control who tells his story. And in this moment, he's acknowledging that I respect the person telling my story. I love this person who is telling my story. I respect her. I trust her. And that means so much.
Yeah, I saw online some people noting that because when he's stepping back and doing that nod, she's singing "I Speak Out Against Slavery." And some people said that he was nodding in shame, like leaning his head down because he didn't do that with his administration.
Yes.
And to me, I do see some of that honoring there, actually, saying, I'm glad that you were able to do what my administration didn't do.
Yeah, I think both of those are worth pointing out, that he steps forward with pride and nods in appreciation and in respect, and maybe, perhaps, yes, in shame, as he's stepping back, hearing those next lines being sung over him, saying, I spoke out against slavery, which she did historically. She hated the practice. She thought that it was abominable. And then she returns to speaking to her husband, saying, you could have done so much more if you only had time. And in that context, to me, it's almost like her reminding us that Hamilton did start out an aggressive abolitionist, writing essays against slavery with his best friend, John Laurens. And if we could just imagine the Alexander Hamilton presidency that never got to happen, I wonder, and it's not really worth wondering too much, but I do wonder whether the slavery issue would have been addressed earlier in our history rather than waiting till the cusp of the Civil War to even get some president who would do anything at all about freeing slaves.
And in that line, you could read some humility there that she feels like Hamilton could have done more with that time, could have done better with that time as well. I like to read that, though, as gender politics at the time. A woman can only do so much in that time because of the way she was treated in law and in politics. And Eliza did blow the roof off a lot of that. And she was able to write a story and a narrative for her husband in a time when women weren't listened to as often. But Hamilton, as a man, may have been able to do more with politics and law and ending slavery and more things like that.
So as he has done a countless number of times throughout this musical, you see the depth and the double entendre and the dual meanings that are inside of these lyrics that can be taken in so many different directions to understand this. Because whether we're talking about how Hamilton could have carried on this legacy of his into more and more areas of his own passions, or whether we're talking about a comparison between whether Eliza could have done more than Hamilton or whether Hamilton could have done more than Eliza. It's just interesting to see all the different facets of the way these lyrics fit together.
And Eliza says, "And when my time is up, have I done enough?" Which, remember earlier in the musical, she wanted to be enough, and now she wants to do enough. And we're going to talk about the orphanage that she starts here in a second. But I wanted to mention that Lin-Manuel Miranda and Pippa attended an honorary luncheon for Eliza at this orphanage and performed That Would Be Enough. And at the end of the song, the children from the orphanage sang in response to Eliza's question, "Eliza, you have done enough." And I saw this from a tweet from Lin-Manuel Miranda, and he couldn't even tell you his thoughts on it. He just said, "I mean, ... And that's exactly how you feel after hearing that. It's just such a beautiful full circle thing. And then Eliza says, "Will they tell our story?" And I love that. It becomes our story, not just your story. And she stops there and says, "Oh, can I show you what I'm proudest of?" And it reminds me of that moment when Philip runs up and says, "Daddy, let me show you this song." It's this person who has done something so great and wants to show a loved one, "Look what I've done for you. Look what I did." And the company answers that, the orphanage.
To me, it's a moment of vulnerability there, where this song has been climbing. With the key change, we saw her ambition growing, her pride growing, and everything she was saying that she has done. And then, it's not surprise when she's saying, "Oh, I'm shocked about one more thing." It's the protective side of her saying, "Oh, there's one more thing." And she lowers her voice somewhat, where she's saying, this is the thing that means the most to her out of all the things she has done to advance Hamilton's legacy.
And when the company says the orphanage, they sing it in the same progression as Eliza's introductory theme, which tells me that that's what she wants her legacy to be. That's what she wants her name to be related to. And I've read online that it's also the same intonation as when they sing Forgiveness and It's Quiet Uptown, showing that the orphanage isn't just a memorial, it's a living act of reconciliation and the way for a couple who lost a child, one of them being an orphan himself, to then care for lost children. And Eliza says, "I help to raise hundreds of children. I get to see them growing up." And on top of the orphanage, she actually started a school in Washington Heights in 1818, the Hamilton Free School. And when Lin-Manuel Miranda found this out, he actually felt like this was a confirmation that he should be doing this show.
Right, because he grew up in Washington Heights, and his first big hit musical was In the Heights.
Absolutely. And so I just love that that is something that he saw and just felt so pulled to do this.
To me, that is in itself an expression of Hamilton's legacy and how far-reaching it is. That we see that someone established a school where kids could be taken care of, an orphanage where kids could be taken care of in that part of New York City. And then later on, generations later, you see another man growing up in that neighborhood, inheriting some of the legacy that the community around him had built up. And Eliza's story is a part of that legacy. And it's just fascinating to see how, if it weren't for Alexander Hamilton's work and the work that Eliza put in after his death, we may have never had the community in which Lin-Manuel Miranda was able to grow up and thrive. And then, by extension, we wouldn't even have this musical about Hamilton's life, full circle. It's just fascinating how interconnected we are as a community and how much we rely on the contributions of our forefathers and of our ancestors and of our friends and community people who are going to help us out and build this type of a community in which we can even pass on the torch to our children and to our friends. And I think that it's important here that Eliza says, in their eyes, thinking of the children that she's raising up, in their eyes, "I see you, Alexander. I see you every time." It's like she's looking at this kid and she's remembering that Alexander Hamilton, the guy I love, the one I've devoted my whole life to, was once a kid like this, who was orphaned, abandoned by his deadbeat dad, orphaned when his mother passed away, and then came to America without a legacy of his own. But then he built a family, and he built a name for himself, and he climbed to prominence. And Eliza's seeing in these kids that potential, that same potential exists in every single one of these children. One of the things I've loved about the way that the original cast has behaved when they're in press conferences, speaking with people representing Hamilton, an American musical, is how people like Chris Jackson will single out kids in the audience, and they will take the time to say, I'm a black man who grew up looking back at these old dead white guys, not thinking that was a part of my story. And here I get to portray George Washington. I get to be this person. I get to climb up into his shoes now because of where we are today. And he'll look at these kids and say, you have a future. You have a gift. And because of the things I know I've been able to do, I know you can also go even further in life. And so the cast really seems to get the fact that this musical is about passing on legacies. It's about passing on the torch to other people to make the world a better place when you leave it than when you entered it.
Absolutely. It's so beautiful. And Eliza is going to do a 3-beat here. She says, and when my time is up, have I done enough? Remember earlier she said, will they tell your story? Will they tell our story? Now she says, will they tell my story? And I really liked, I think we mentioned this early on in the podcast. Remember, this show's just called Hamilton. This is also Eliza's story. This is Lin-Manuel Miranda telling Eliza's story as well.
I like that a lot, that not only is she taking ownership of narrating her husband's story, she's taking ownership of the story itself. And I think that that's one thing that we do whenever we lose someone close to us. We are now the embodiment of their legacy. And Eliza understands that this is not just a story that is now buried in the ground and it doesn't have an impact anymore. This is a story that is living, and it is something she is a part of and that she owns. Eliza's final words in this musical are, "Oh, I can't wait to see you again. It's only a matter of time." In the staging of our musical, while the company sings the final lines, "Will they tell your story? Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?" Eliza is joined on stage by Alexander Hamilton, her husband, who stands up beside her, and they don't look at each other yet. She's saying, "I can't wait to see you again," but she can't see him yet. And then they walk away from each other slightly, make a circle backwards, and then they look towards one another, and Alexander puts his hand out, and he beckons her toward him. And remember, in this song, we've seen people passing over to the other side with Washington, people putting on those white coats, going to the other side, and here Hamilton is reaching out to his wife because it's only a matter of time before she will be reunited in heaven with her Hamilton in her mind here. She is now seeing him again, and she takes his hand, walks across the veil towards him, and they walk to the front of the stage, and Hamilton himself, Lin-Manuel Miranda, points towards the audience, and Eliza's eyes are opened, and her jaw drops, and it's like she sees the audience for the first time, and she sees all of these people. Oh my goodness, they are hearing my story. They see my story. They see what is going on. And there are so many ways to take that scene that are really powerful and meaningful. It's Eliza joining Hamilton in the afterlife, the person she's wanted to be reunited with, and then Hamilton himself looking down with his wife saying, "Hey, look, look, look. They're telling my story there on Broadway. They're doing it."
And it's also Lin-Manuel Miranda pointing and saying, "We're telling your story." At this moment in the musical, the last thing saying is, "Who tells your story?" This question. And it's Hamilton or Lin-Manuel Miranda, however you're interpreting it, pointing out and answering the question. We're telling this story. This story is being told. Look. And Pippa, playing Eliza, walks to the lip of the stage, looks out in just joy, I imagine, and lets out a gasp as she looks at the audience and the lights go black.
I love the idea that we are the people continuing that story. I love both interpretations as well, of this being Lin-Manuel Miranda telling Eliza Hamilton, "Hey, don't worry, we're going to tell your story, and we are going to take this to Broadway, and we are going to make sure people remember the narrative of your husband, but also your own narrative and your own contributions." And I also appreciate the effect that's used by a lot of storytellers, where they will give you the story, but they're not going to give you the moral or the punchline. They just leave it open at the end, saying, "And what are you going to do with this, audience? What are you going to do with this story we just told? We have presented the story to you. You've seen it on this stage. What are you personally going to do now that you have paid a lot of money to sit in this theater seat and watch this brilliant cast of actors present to you the story of Alexander Hamilton and his wife, what are you going to do? Are you going to tell that story? Are you going to grab onto nuggets of wisdom from their story? Are you going to advance this in your lives? Are you going to fan the flame into a bigger flame? Are you going to learn from their legacy and take the torch that they've passed on to you and run with it? So to me, this is that involvement where George Washington faded into the ensemble and he's just a part of the story now. Angelica and Eliza and Peggy and Alexander and, yes, Aaron Burr have all been a part of this narrative we've been telling, but they're now background to the American story. And the American story is now ours to advance. And it's like the question of, what are you going to do? Are you going to let injustices happen? Are you going to let politics happen that you don't agree with? Are you going to engage in rap battles with the people you disagree with? Are you going to love the political enemies like you have Madison and Hamilton who fight their whole lives, and then Eliza Hamilton and Dolly Madison get together to raise funds together for George Washington's monument? That's fascinating. You see that people are working across aisles. People are working against each other. You have tension in the American narrative. You have this great unfinished symphony that is dissonant and harmonious back and forth. And the question is, as we take the story that our founding fathers have given us, how are we going to honor their memories and advance the torch into new areas of justice and freedom?
Absolutely. I could not have said it better. I would like to just take this moment as we end this musical as a whole to thank Lin-Manuel Miranda specifically, but all of the cast and creators of Hamilton and the American Musical for providing us with this beautiful story and the opportunity for us to talk about it on this podcast and to continue it this way.
And we also want to thank you, the listeners to this podcast. You've put up with us for a really long time now. You've listened to us for a lot of hours, and we just are grateful to be a part of this community that is discussing Alexander Hamilton. It's fantastic, it's wonderful, and it's meaningful. I just want to make sure you understand how much we appreciate the support you've given us, the help you've given us in encouraging us, sharing articles with us, helping us learn more from what you've already seen, telling us your stories and your experiences with the musical, with the historical books you're reading, the articles you've found. We've been able to learn from you guys so much, and we hope that we've been able to help you learn and a part of this process as well.
And we'd also like to thank you, the listener, for your grace in staying with us, as we're not professional historians. We're not necessarily even professional podcasters. We do this in my living room for fun because we love it.
We absolutely do. I have had a blast recording this with you. And thank you, Vinton, for letting me be on the podcast network with you, joining you in this fun adventure that has been.
You actually beat me to it because I was planning on thanking you. So thank you, Robbie, for joining me in this and helping me fall in love with Hamilton in the first place.
Well, you're welcome. I'm grateful beyond belief. But much in the same way that Alexander Hamilton's story is not ending at the curtain call and is being instead put into the hands of the audience, our podcast itself is not ending now. We are going to continue this story. We are going to continue this adventure that has been exploring Broadway, that has been exploring history, that has been learning new things and springboarding into new adventures. This is and will always be Hamilton the podcast. So we're not going too far from our roots, and we will consistently return to themes that we unpack throughout Hamilton, an American Musical. But we are going to now branch out in the next few weeks to see more and more exciting things that are Hamilton adjacent, so to speak.
That's absolutely right. Next week, you can catch us doing What Comes Next, a small segment where we're going to talk about the cast and creators of Hamilton and where they have gone from here and where you can now find them and see what else they are doing.
Another What Comes Next episode that we will be doing soon will cover Aaron Burr and the treason trials, the conspiracy years. We'll also have a musical review of 1776, a musical that follows John Adams' life, and we're also going to do a book review of the book 1776 by David McCullough. So if you're interested in reading that book, watching that musical online, or listening to the soundtrack yourself, definitely do that. Join us on that next adventure. It's going to be fun to unpack how the history overlaps with those things.
This podcast is brought to you ad-free by our wonderful Patreon supporters who donate money to keep everything here at Graphomania running. If you would like to be a part of that, you can check out patreon.com/graphocast, GRAPHOCAST, donate some money and get some exclusive goodies for doing so, and keep the lights on here. If you'd like to get into contact with us, remember you can leave comments on the website, graphocast.com, GRAPHOCAST. You can email us, contact@graphocast.com. You can tweet at us, @graphocast. Or personally, I'm @FleshEater.
And I'm @Alpha Knight.
And we'll see you next week as we continue telling his story. This has been a Graphomania production. If you would like to hear more podcasts, go to graphocast.com, GRAPHOCAST.com. Follow us on Twitter @Graphocast and like the Graphomania page on Facebook for news and updates.